Their demographic structure is obviously far better than Europe or East Asia's, but it's not as good as it used to be. They started urbanizing very seriously in the early 1990s and have been aging as a result. So actually, Mexico has a significantly healthier demographic structure now. But more importantly, the infrastructure and the political infrastructure in India is poor, and it's difficult to integrate among the cities and among the regions. So as we lose Chinese manufacturing, countries around the world are going to pick up pieces of that to service their own markets. India is part of that story, but India will never rely on other countries politically, and honestly, it can't economically, for participating in a multi-country supply chain systems like we're familiar with in Europe and in North America. India will produce things for Indians. And when you're producing things for 1.5 billion people, that is a global story. But India will not be trading with hardly anyone as part of that story. I think Brazil has had its moment. Brazil's infrastructure is really difficult because it's built basically on imagine Brazil as a table, but two of the legs have been knocked out. Unfortunately, the high end is on the coast. So the cities on the edge can access the interior, but it's very hard for them to get to the water. And that's why Sao Paulo is the biggest one, because it's on top of the plateau and it has a little bit more room to expand. That makes it very difficult for Brazil to integrate with anyone, even Argentina. They were able in the 80s and 90s to develop a series of technologies and some manufacturing capacity that was fairly impressive. But then the Chinese came in under the first Lula government and set up a bunch of joint ventures and basically raped the Brazilians of all of the technology, and then went back home and stole all of Brazilians' market share in global trade and destroyed the entire manufacturing base. So that story is over. So Brazil is still a commodities producer, and that's about it. They have a demographic structure that's similar to India, so good, but not as good as Mexico.
Yeah, you think Brazil will be the next Russia?
To expect Brazilian commodities to fall off the market, especially when it comes to things like iron ore. But the capital cost of developing stuff in Brazil is just higher than the global average. And whenever there's a competing source that opens up, it's able to undercut the Brazilians on price. That's probably most obvious in oil. Yes, they've got the pre-salt. Yes, by the numbers, Brazil probably can become an exporter to the tune of 3 or 4 million barrels a day. But you're talking about a cost of production in those zones. It's at least $80 to $90 a barrel, and that's some of the highest in the world. And not just because I have citizenship. A couple other things that are kind of color that. The United States has the highest security of any country. The average citizen has higher security than any time in history without the artificial imposition of things like the global order. And we're probably going to have to double the size of the industrial plant over the course of this next decade simply to produce the things that we used to get from imports. And if you think of the last time that the United States had a growth spurt like that, and the last time the Germans were dealing with security and economic dislocations, 1 million Germans came to the United States in the 1840s and changed our political culture forever. I expect another mass move of much larger scale this time, and not just from Germany. So, it's hard to go wrong here. Obviously, the United States has other issues that you have to deal with. Me personally, because I'm a little atypical, I went to university in New Zealand, so I couldn't qualify for citizenship there anytime I want to. It's not that New Zealand is self-sufficient when it comes to things like food and energy. It is part of an internationalized supply chain system that it needs. But it's an extended part of the American family, and it's an extended part of the Southeast Asian network as well. So it is heavily exposed to both of the two big growth poles of the future. And in addition, if we get into a situation where the Kiwis have major security problems, the rest of us are long gone already. The problem with calling a super cycle is it implies that everything is going to remain globalized, and I don't think that's the case. And as the world breaks up into economic blocks, you're going to have different market patterns for each commodity based on where they're sourced and where they're needed. Okay. So in the case of the Western Hemisphere, which is probably going to be more or less one block, this is where most of the world's copper comes from, with Chile, to a lesser degree Bolivia, and then the United States and Canada being the big players. So when you're talking about the world needing to triple the amount of copper, we can't do that. But if all the major copper producers are in one block, then all of a sudden it becomes very doable because we don't need to triple it. We just take the parts that we're going to the rest of the world and we use them locally. That works here. It probably will with lithium as well. All the cobalt's in Congo. There's no way to make that work. Most of the nickel is in Russia. Oh my God, now we're talking about doing a neo-colonial war into Siberia in order to keep the nickel flowing? Oh! So you break up the markets, and the very concept of a super cycle doesn't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
Months where, like, say, the Swedes actually drop the information they've got, and the Europeans just completely stop all oil and natural gas that is flowing west from Russia. I'm not just saying stop using, stop the flows, because that's where this leads. Energy prices globally skyrocket. And then the Biden administration is going to have to make some interesting choices. In existing American law, the American president can shut off oil exports with a flick of a pen. Does not require Congress. So we could see the world losing Russian oil and American oil at the same time. And in that sort of scenario, you easily get a global price that goes above 150 or even 200. And you easily get a price in the United States that drops below 70 and never rises past 70 again. Again, we're not in a single market anymore, and commodities have yet to reflect that. From a global point of view, a global recession is already hardwired in. The IMF actually expects the lowest growth that we have seen since at least the 1980s for the next decade. That it does not take into account demographic decay. That does not take into account a Russia war that goes to its logical conclusion one way or another. So the best case scenario for the world as a whole is roughly 0% growth for the next 10 years. It does not take a lot to take a 0% growth story into recessionary territory. We all need to just kind of pencil that in. But 0 or below on average is not the same as 0 everywhere. In the case of the United States, we need to double the size of the industrial plant. That's highly inflationary, but that's a massive growth story.
So I buy American stocks right now.
Yeah, well, one of the things to keep in mind is as the baby boomers are leaving the market because they're all retiring and cashing in their investments, in a couple of years, we're going to be in an environment where if you have capital, that's going to be very valuable. And we're nearing an interesting entry point into the financial markets that can maintain liquidity. I don't consider myself even a quasi-expert in that category. The problem is that so many of them have industrial uses in addition, and in the green transition and a lot of this retooling of manufacturing that we have to do on a global basis anyway, a lot of them have a lot of needs. So that is very bullish for them, independent of what anyone might consider in terms of using them as a hedge against inflation or as a financial asset in its own right. And that makes them all wildly volatile. And then, of course, you have to look at where they come from. If you're looking at platinum, you're talking South Africa. That's probably okay. If you're looking at palladium, you're talking northern Russia, and that's probably not.
Okay.
I don't want to give you a price forecast because I don't have one. All I can tell you is that the majority of the world's copper does come from the Western Hemisphere, and I don't see a security reason why the supply should be interrupted. Now, the growth story for copper until now has been hand in hand with globalization, and that's why China has been the world's largest absorber of copper for decades. I think that's going to stop cold. But if we are going to electrify everything, that's technically a bigger demand story.
Yeah.
States is in the process of being phased out because the natural gas that comes out of the shale fields is primarily now a waste product, and it just can't compete on price. But if you break down global trade, one of the things that people forget is in terms of international energy patterns, oil and natural gas, those are the low carbon fuels, and they're internationally traded. So you break that down, and most countries have to go back to something they can get locally, which is coal, which is exactly what the Germans are doing today. The world's single largest producer and exporter of fertilizers of all types is Russia. And specifically, nitrogen fertilizers are a subset of natural gas, or produced from natural gas. So as Russian energy falters, you should expect that to go away as well. And roughly half of the world's potash comes from Belarus and Russia specifically, at some very specific sites that are having some technical problems because of labor issues.